Welcome, everyone. I'm very grateful that you made the time to be here today. To start with, I have some questions for you. Have you ever wondered how to share your experience with your clients without them feeling that you are telling them what to do? Have you ever wondered what you could do to engage your coaching clients very deeply into the coaching dialogue? And would you like to learn a technique for creating and shaping the experience and motivation of your coaching client in and beyond the coaching session? If you've wondered about some of these questions, you will enjoy the session today and hopefully develop a deeper appreciation of how you can integrate story and metaphor in your coaching sessions. Thinking about story and metaphor will, of course, lead me to a story. A father was trying to read his newspaper, but his little son kept pestering him, trying to win his attention. Finally, the father grew tired of this and tore a page from the paper, one that bore a map of the world. He cut it into several pieces and handed it to his son. And he said, "Right now, you've got something to do. I've given you a map of the world, and I want to see if you can put it back together correctly." He resumed his reading, knowing that the task would keep the child occupied for the rest of the day. However, 15 minutes later, the boy returned with a map, and it was complete, put together in precisely the right way. The father was astonished, and he thought that it was unbelievable that his son could accomplish such a difficult task so quickly. Which makes me think of another story. A tourist was traveling in a far off country on foot. It was a long, hot, sweltering day, and he felt the weariness of walking all day when he reached the bank of a vast river. The river looked deep, the fast flowing current seemed strong. He saw no bridge or any visible means of crossing, and standing there, feeling the first chill of the approaching night, he pondered long on how he could get across. But no idea presented itself to him. Eventually, he gave up, and he was about to retrace his steps when he saw an old man standing on the opposite bank. And he shouted across to the old man, "Excuse me, sir, I am stranded here. Can you tell me how I may get across to the other side?" Isn't this the kind of situation that we often arrive at as coaches with our clients? They end up in a place or a space where they need to solve a problem and cross their river to the place they want to be. And they ask their question expecting an answer which they hope we can give. And it's almost like the man walking down a dark street at night, following his path from street lamp to street lamp. And close to his house, he found his neighbor on his knees, searching for something. Being a naturally helpful person, he asked his neighbor what he was looking for under the street lamp. And his neighbor replied, "I'm looking for my front door key. Will you help me?" The man agreed, and he got down on his hands and knees like his neighbor and started searching. After about 30 minutes of crawling around, he asked his neighbor, "Are you sure you lost your key here?" And his neighbor said, "No, I lost it in the bushes by my front door." And is this not how we sometimes feel as coaches? Looking into a client created space where we think we understand the problem, but the solution continues to evade us. And this is where story and metaphor may be a great tool in helping us as coaches to help our clients. But not yet. Let's first talk about what we can expect from tonight and in the week ahead. Our topic tonight will be how we can use story and metaphor as hypnotic techniques in our coaching sessions. We will briefly discuss the importance of story and metaphor, how we can use it to create experiences for our clients, and then how to create stories and metaphors of our own to share with our clients. Now, next week, we will spend time on creative and guided imagery as a coaching intervention to help our clients evoke and generate imaginative mental images to extend their awareness and gain new perspectives on issues or challenges they have. We will also discuss how we can use guided visualizations to create states of commitment, motivation, and energy to support them beyond the coaching sessions in the achievement of their goals and outcomes. Then there's also another talk on Monday next week on the magic of hypnotic storytelling. That talk is not specifically designed for coaches, but still, it's a fun way of learning how to create deeply immersive and persuasive experiences for teaching sessions, for sales meetings, and other applications that you can think of. Let's get back to the topic at hand. I'm inviting each of you, where you are, just to sit back, relax, take a deep breath in and out, and just take a moment to come to presence for yourself in any way that serves you. And give yourself permission to surrender to this moment and enjoy one of my favorite poems, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. There are so many reasons I love this poem, and top of the list is the experience it creates for the listener. What does this poem mean to you? What emotions and feelings did it awaken for you? What lessons does it have for you? In my interpretation of this poem, could the two paths be a metaphor for my life? This is an interpretation that makes me feel nostalgic about the paths I've taken, not knowing what other paths could have brought or not. And my lessons, does this poem represent for me choices or outcomes? Or maybe one experience means the exclusion of another. Is this what Robert Frost meant when he wrote that poem? The truth is, in 1915, Frost sent an envelope to Edward Thomas that contained only one item, a draft of The Road Not Taken, under the title Two Roads. According to an interpretation of Lawrence Thompson, Frost was inspired to write the poem by Edward Thomas's habit of regretting whatever path the pair took during their long walks in the countryside, an impulse that Frost equated with the romantic predisposition for crying over what might have been. Frost believed that his friend would take the poem as a gentle joke. And this is precisely the power of metaphor and story. It allows us to explore the world through our imagination and to create the meaning that we want. And the same story or the same poem can create vastly different interpretations depending on who is listening. Storytelling has always been a part of the human experience. In ancient times, it was how lessons, culture, and values were spread from generation to generation. Until we started writing down our history, storytelling was the library shared from memory. And even today, storytelling is a credible and memorable form of communication. In ancient Eastern tradition, storytelling was often used as a form of counseling and therapy. If a person was struggling with an issue, a healer or an elder would often prescribe a story which bore a similarity to the dilemma, and they were expected to meditate on it. Reflection on the story would then lead the person to a metaphor or a perspective which offered clarity on the problem. Which brings us to the question, how does storytelling work? Modern neuroscience tells us that there's a particular phenomenon associated with storytelling. When telling a story, the brain waves of an interested audience start cycling at the same frequency as that of the storyteller, which means that storytelling is a powerful way of gaining rapport with individuals and groups. We use story and metaphor for numerous purposes. We use it to pass on information and knowledge, to educate, to encourage healing and growth, to facilitate creative problem solving, to extend awareness, to create perspectives. And even as you are sitting there, you are probably thinking of many others. Storytelling is particularly useful for learning and memory. It creates context and it sparks novelty and interest. A story ties together facts and lessons in an exciting way. It provides context for understanding. It surprises and delights us. And the result is a memorable experience that can guide and inform. Good stories influence how we see the world and how we behave in it. It provides patterns for the way we experience the world and how to live our lives. When we tell a story, the listener has to create a parallel experience in their mind to relate and understand the story. And by doing this, they assimilate lessons and patterns of behavior that may be useful or impactful in their own understanding of their lives. To relate to a story, the listener has to go inside their memories, their thoughts, and emotions, which disconnects them from the present moment and very often creates what we call a story trance. Listening to stories that are unfamiliar or are contrary to habitual behavior brings with it a pattern interrupt which disrupts our habitual thinking, and it forces us to extend our thinking into a broader awareness. As coaches, much of our storytelling is personal storytelling. It is an excellent technique to use for entrancement and building connection with coaching clients, and then to show them patterns which can inform and support their personal growth and behavior in support of their outcomes. To do this, the coach has to focus on collecting stories and develop their storytelling and story crafting abilities. The first one is easy. A collection of ready to tell stories at their fingertips is a useful resource to gather for any coach. I always keep an eye and an ear open for stories and metaphors that I can add to my collection to use in my coaching sessions. I scour the internet for teaching tales and metaphors that may be useful, specifically with my target group of clients. Once you start looking, there are many collections of short stories and tales that carry moral lessons and behaviors. Simple examples are the Aesop's tales, the many collections of fairy and folk tales, and collections like Chicken Soup for the Soul. There's a whole series of books in that genre. The second part is a little more difficult. To become a good storyteller, it takes practice. For us as coaches, we want to use stories to excite the imagination. So we must focus on stories that represent the senses vividly, that encourages strong feelings, powerful emotions, profound reflection, irresistible states, and above all, the deep desire for transformation and change. And in doing that, we have to enrich our stories with the hooks, the patterns, and the prompts to create and entice the experience. We must craft the coaching stories we want to use and design them in such a way that it creates the intended effect. A story is never just a story. Our stories, our coaching stories, are tools for creating transformative change. And we build them for that purpose. We will talk a little more about the mechanics of story creation a little later. Another aspect of storytelling we should look at in the coaching relationship is the client as the storyteller. In coaching sessions, we may ask the client to tell us their story around their problem state or the outcome that they desire. And in listening to their story, we can start looking for the plot, the perspectives, the assumptions, and the limitations which can guide us to strategies to intervene in their habitual thinking. An effective way of extracting the story of a client is to ask them to tell the story from a different perspective or a different perceptual position, which is often a great learning experience for the client. I can speak for hours on storytelling techniques with the coach as storyteller or the client as storyteller, but let us consider where stories are appropriate in the coaching conversation. I use stories and storytelling extensively in my coaching. For preparation, I will often ask my coaching clients to read stories like The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, which is a great story to frame the personal growth journey that they are about to embark upon. For clients who profess not to be readers, I will pick movies with a strong hero's journey storyline and advise them to watch that. There are a number of my favorite movies that I recommend, like The Shawshank Redemption, Field of Dreams, or the original Star Wars A New Hope, all of which demonstrates transformational journeys of lead characters. Alternatively, I will send clients links to fictional and non-fictional narratives, depending on the kind of coaching topics we focus on. Before the first coaching sessions, I will typically send them more generalized suggestions, like The Alchemist and the movies I mentioned. And after coaching sessions, I will send them more targeted pieces along the theme of their challenges or outcomes. During sessions, there are multiple opportunities to engage with story. I've spoken a number of times through the coaching conversation, and I mentioned that we have an opening. The opening is where you connect with the client and gain their rapport. The contracting, where you agree on the outcome that they want to pursue in the coaching conversation. The exploring, which is where we explore deeply the issue or the outcome that they want to achieve, and we create possibilities. And then, in a use of convergent thinking, we will narrow our focus down to the most likely ideas to implement the outcomes. Then, in actioning, we will put together an action plan for them that they can commit to beyond the coaching session. In the insights part of the session, the client will share any insights that they've had during the coaching session. And then in the closing, we will typically wrap up the session. Now, that's really rushing through this process. But what I want to spend a little bit more time on is how you could use storytelling during these different stages of the coaching conversation. Often in the opening stage, I will use a story or stories to create a state of presence in my client and to gain a deeper level of rapport. Then moving into the contracting stage, I might use stories about purpose or vision or goal setting, especially if I am working with a client that are a little reserved in setting stretch goals for themselves. A good example of a story that I've used in the past in the contracting stage is the very familiar story of King Midas, who wished for the ability to turn everything he touches into gold. And that's a great goal setting story because he wanted one thing without considering the consequences of his wish. And he only found out that this goal that he set for himself in terms of what he wanted was not the goal that materialized. To the letter, it was, but to the intent, it wasn't. We can also focus on creating metaphors for this outcome stage or the contracting stage. And an example of how we would go about creating metaphor is by connecting meaning through comparing things and then making them the same. For example, a client might say to me, I want to be more visible. And we may agree that being more visible and being seen is to shine in front of others. And what is it that shines? It might be a star. So we would create an outcome metaphor for the client that simply says, I want to be a star. Then moving on to the exploring stage, I might use stories that demonstrate problem solving or stimulate reflection on an issue or behavior. This is also the stage where stories about creativity, reframing, and expanding possibilities are most useful. An example of a story that I've used here in the past is the very familiar one about Edison and his failures in building the light bulb. I use that story as an illustration for problem solving. I might also ask the client to tell me the story or craft the metaphor for how they would like to see their achievement play out in the future. Their imagined future story requires them to access imaginative abilities and connect with resources they want to create or expand. Then we go to the actioning stage. Here we often use stories about achieving goals, stories about persistence, stories about courage, and how to utilize those to support motivation around action plans and execution. A favorite of mine here is the story about the persistence of Colonel Sanders, who at a very advanced age persisted in selling his recipe and ultimately succeeding with his venture called Kentucky Fried Chicken. The insight stage usually belongs to the client. And I will sometimes ask them as they are sharing their insights to expand on metaphors that they've created for themselves or stories that they've created for themselves in terms of their insights. I like to follow the storyline of what they've learned, and I ask them often to explain how these learning and insights will play into their future and the person that they will become. Then we get to the closing stage, and this is where I want to close the session and send them away with a heightened state of commitment, motivation, and energy. I don't often use story here, but I often extend stories that I started earlier with the intention to revivify and emphasize the desired states. And when I do this, there's always a strong emphasis placed on success and high self esteem. Although there is a wealth of stories out there that you as a coach can reference, you mustn't overlook your most valuable resource for stories, your own stories. If you've picked as a coach the right niche that resonates with your skills and abilities, you have access to a wealth of your own experience and insight, which you can share with your client. And the more personal the stories are, the deeper the connection you will gain with your clients. But to have stories that work, you have to make sure that those stories are compelling, engaging, and above all, demonstrates value. Let us look at how you would build up your stories into a compelling structure. In his book, Writing a Novel and Getting Published, Nigel Watts explains the 8-point arc for constructing a story. It starts with stasis or status quo, where we join the main character of the story where they are in life. Then something happens, a trigger that is outside the control of the main character, which makes the status quo impossible to continue. The quest is the response that the main character have to the challenge. The main character normally goes on a quest or do something significant to enable them to return to the status quo or to a new status quo. The surprise is something that's unexpected, and it either happens or it presents an unexpected obstacle that the main character has to deal with. Then we get to choice. The critical choice represents a dilemma that either changes the course of the main character's quest or it forces a peak of tension that plays out in the achievement of the story. The climax represents the choice that the main character makes that will be pursued for the rest of the story. And the reversal shows the consequences of that climax or choice. Then the resolution is either the return to status quo or a new status quo. That may seem like a fairly academic structure. So, what I'm going to do is I will tell you a story of mine that I've converted into this structure. And what I'll do is I'll start by mentioning the specific arc point, and then I'll give you my piece of story that fits into that. And of course, when I really tell the story, I won't refer to the arc points, but I would love for you to just keep track as I move through this story of where I am and how the story fits together. So I'll start with the status quo. Many years ago, I was working as an employee for a small startup business that became very successful. And it seemed like we went from 20 employees to 200 overnight, even though that happened over a time span of 2 years. Trigger. While we were still a small company, my boss dangled in front of me the promise of becoming a director in the company if I achieved certain goals, which I did, but the promise was not kept. Quest. So I resigned and I started my own company. Surprise. And I sold work for 3 months, and then suddenly I had no work or income for 18 months. After seeing many clients and getting used to rejection, I came to the realization that I was burning through all my savings. And at that point, a sense of desperation set in. Choice. A client materialized who wanted me to do training for them instead of the service I tried to sell them. And they asked for a 5-day course, which I did not have. And I agreed. Climax. I thought I had a couple of weeks to develop the materials I needed. The client confirmed the same day, a Wednesday, that they expected me to run the course on the Monday. So, what was I to do? Was I going to say to them, no, thank you, I just don't have the time? Or was I going to do this? I wrote a manual in 3 days. Over the weekend, I was able to build enough slides to last me until lunch on the first day. As I arrived there that morning, I was absolutely stressed out. And I started presenting this course, but in every break and during lunch, I built more slides. And thankfully, scraped through to the end of that day. That evening, I created my slides for the next day. Every evening after that, I finished just enough work that I could complete the course on the Friday. Reversal. I decided to start marketing that training, and suddenly I discovered a whole market of clients that could use this training. Resolution. And that training course launched a business that persists to this day, 18 years later. And it allowed me to work independently as the master of my own fate. Sometimes we are blind to what strengths we have and what results unexpectedly come if we are open to it. And that's the end of that story. So, this is an example of how you can construct a story from your own experience. However, you will not always have the luxury of time to create a story. Sometimes you have to make it up on the spot. So I'm going to introduce you to a slightly shortened process, which I call improvisational metaphoring. The process to create a story is slightly different, and the intention is that you can make the story up on the spot. The majority of my personal stories in coaching sessions is created using this kind of approach. It has the following steps. The first step is to transform the client into a parallel character. The second step is to define an ideal behavior or the ideal events that this client needs. Then build the ideal resources, resolve the conflict in the best way possible, and then future pace. What will be the outcome of the best case scenario in the future? So let's do an example of crafting a story. And I'm going to start with transform. As you are sitting in the coaching session, listening to your client and the issue that they are experiencing, you will start thinking about a character that is a parallel for your client in such a way that they won't necessarily identify themselves, but what will allow them to recognize the situation. For example, if your client is a senior manager, you might go and create a parallel character of an army captain commanding a company, and then find a parallel for his situation, which includes the ideal behaviors and the ideal events that, if those play out, it might give your client clues about what thinking they can pursue for themselves. So, in terms of behavior and events, you will draft a parallel situation that describes what is happening and what is creating difficulty. So, if your client, for example, has a struggle with conflict with a team member, you can go and create a parallel conflict. And his parallel version might be a soldier, a captain, who is struggling with a sergeant in his company that consistently does the opposite to what he's supposed to do, and they are about to go into battle. Once you know what this parallel situation is, then you are going to start focusing on the kind of resources that you want your client to access. I could, for example, say that the captain was a calm, confident man, calmness and confidence being resources that I think this client should invest in. The captain was a calm and confident man that knew merely ordering the sergeant around will not get the result he wanted. So I'm playing around with the situation. So he called the man over and asked him what he would do when faced with the upcoming battle. And what happens in my client's mind, because he is trying to make sense of this story, he's starting to think, so what would he be doing if he was the captain with the soldier? And then I give him some suggestions. After listening to the sergeant, he started asking him questions about his assumptions. He pointed out flaws in his reasoning until the sergeant understood what needed to be done to win the battle. So, in that parallel story, I've now created a few scenarios which this client can create thinking with and start playing with. And then I future pace the story and I start describing the outcome with the ideal behavior. And the story goes on. It says, with the united company, the battle was over in a few minutes with no loss of life. The sergeant did his duty exactly as planned, and it contributed to no loss of life. Sometimes giving people the space to figure out what needs to be done and supporting them leads to great success. In that moment, using a relatively simple process, I created a small parallel story that reflected in many ways the issue that my client was dealing with. And I created some examples in that story that would expand my client's awareness about their own behavior and potentially what other behaviors they could consider in dealing in real life with their own employee, which they struggled with. There is a last stanza to the poem, The Road Not Taken, that I did not share with you earlier, and it goes like this. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And this is a beautiful example of how the poet starts telling the story in the first three stanzas. And then in the final stanza, he future paces, almost like he's looking back to the first three stanzas from many years later. Now, before we end the session this evening, there are a few loose themes we have to tie up. Do you remember the time where a man was helping his neighbor looking for a key? And after 30 minutes of crawling around, when he asked his neighbor, "Are you sure you lost your key here?" And his neighbor said, "No, I lost it in the bushes by my front door." And the man felt at a loss of words for a moment. He felt the frustration rising and he asked, "But why are we searching over here then?" And the neighbor said, "Because the light is better here." As coaches, we have to make sure that we are solving the right problem. Often our clients hide the real issue by disguising it within another. Or even worse, they expect us to give them solutions and ask questions of us that we can only interpret from our own perspective. So it becomes crucial to follow the client's narrative and find the real story. Like the tourist on the bank of the river who shouted to the old man on the other side, "Excuse me, sir, I'm stranded here. Can you tell me how I may get across to the other side?" To which the old man shouted back, "But you are already on the other side." As a coach, we can only guide our clients through a process, not give them answers. They are in a situation we can only interpret from our point of view, which will be different from their reality. But we can help them understand their own story and find their path through their reality to discover what their prize is at the end of their race, if they are willing to run. Which brings us back to the story of the little boy, his father, and the map of the world. And the father who was amazed that his son could put together the picture of the world so quickly. "Has your mother been teaching you geography?" asked the father in astonishment. "I don't even know what that means," replied the boy. But there was a photo of a person on the other side of the page. So I put the person back together, and I found that I had put the world back together too. Now, one interpretation of this story may be that there's always another way to solve a problem. And I love that such a simple story can tell us that our imagination is a fantastic resource to find other ways of doing things. Another interpretation is my favorite one, and it's the one that is useful to all of us as coaches. If that person in the picture on the back of the map was me, or if it was my client, there's a different lesson we can take on a metaphoric level from this little story. And it's this: if we take the time and we practice the self care we need, the world will come together in a way that will make us all whole. So let's wrap up this session. Stories and metaphors provide excellent tools for a coach to invite their client deeper into a world of learning. It allows the coach to share information and experiences. It allows the coach to extend awareness to the senses and the unconscious mind, and mostly to engage creative thinking and creative problem solving. I would encourage all of you to explore stories and metaphor. Practice creating it, practice using it, and see the possibility it opens up for you and your clients. Thank you very much for showing up today, and good luck with your coaching practice.